Well, let's sort through it. You've kind of grouped the teams into different categories in the Big Ten as we check out our big story. We've got the storylines going down the stretch. Everyone plays every weekend the rest of the way, all conference games. You got 5 teams that have already wrapped up bowl bids, 3 very much in the CFP conversation as well in Michigan, Ohio State, and Illinois. And then 8 teams are still in the bowl conversation. So let's start with the teams trying to get to a bowl, and I think there are kind of varying degrees of how plausible it is, whether or not these teams will get there. But there are a few that have jumped out at you. Who are they and why are they jumping out?
Well, like you say, there's a lot of different reasons why someone can be bowl eligible. And you always looking at the schedule, and we can look at some of these schedules down the road. You know, are you the favorite? Are you a matchup opponent? Are you healthy this time of year? What recruits you invite to what games, I think, has a lot to do with it. Going to a bowl for some teams is a big part of recruiting. So, it just depends on every team and every schedule.
All right, so what are the ones that interest you the most here?
Well, I have to look at the schedules, but I mean, Minnesota obviously can finish. Rutgers is first. If you look at them, they've got a tough way to go. So let's look at it here. It might be a little bit easier for me to do it this way.
They're 4-4 right now, so need to win 2 of these here down the stretch, Coach. And you got some tough matchups with Michigan and Penn State.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And they're going to have to play their best. So this is one of the teams that it's really difficult to get bowl eligible. But the fact that they're in a position for bowl eligibility at this time is something that motivates a team.
All right, so that's the situation with Rutgers. Would probably need to beat Maryland in order to get bowl eligible there, which would be challenging. What do you see with Wisconsin here and a streak of 20 in a row in terms of seasons that they have made it to a bowl game?
Yeah, and who thought that Wisconsin would be in this position, right? But, I mean, there's been a lot of unexpected things that have happened to Wisconsin this year, and this certainly is one. They're not usually fighting for a bowl game at this particular time, but it'll be important for Jim Leonhard and the program to finish with a bowl. If he becomes the permanent coach, then he's going to have a bowl practice to work. So he's got a lot of things, a lot of reasons to be bowl eligible.
That feels like a really interesting one there. I mean, it does still feel like maybe need to pull an upset along the way. I mean, those are, I know, games that you would probably term matchup opponents. Let's look at Wisconsin one more time, if we could. Games that you would probably term matchup opponents here, but I think based on the year, the game on Saturday becomes an enormous one with Maryland. Iowa's probably a toss-up. Nebraska's the one you feel like you're better than, and Wisconsin against Minnesota, I think you'd probably have to lean Minnesota right now. I mean, again, probably a toss-up, but this really tells you a lot about where they are under Jim Leonhard.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you look at the Maryland game, crossover, right, Pat? Being able to defend the pass against Maryland is going to be important. But you look at those last 3. I mean, Nebraska's getting better. I think Iowa probably feels as good about themselves now as ever. And then Minnesota's under the same pressure to win out, in my opinion, and show progress and that they're still a solid program.
Let's look at the last one I know you wanted to single out, and that is Michigan State. It's been a really tough year. When you look at this, I mean, realistically, Rutgers and Indiana feel like teams they match up really well with. That gets them to 5 if they were able to win both those games. But Illinois and Penn State, obviously very challenging games. And now you're dealing with 8 players being suspended, 5 of them players who have started on defense. It feels like a team amidst some turmoil. What does this stretch run mean for them?
Well, again, they match up well with Rutgers and Indiana. The Illinois game, Illinois has to continue to deal with success, so they've got an issue. They're challenged to be ready mentally. And then Penn State, they've tried to make this a rival. I think it was Joe Paterno and George Perlis that got on the phone one day and said, "How's the land-grant trophy sound?" So they made it a rivalry. So, but yeah, it's going to be a tough go for Michigan State.
It's an odd-looking trophy. I've always believed it's one of our oddest-looking trophies. But yeah, challenging. And again, with all the momentum that they had last year, I mean, if they could figure out a way to get 3 more, would really be positive heading into the offseason. So now you've got a group of teams who you were saying cannot afford to be upset down the stretch. Well, why do you group these teams that way?
Because being upset means that you were favored to win, and most likely you have more talent, right? So you're trying to finish the season strong. It's going to impact recruiting. It's going to impact everything you do. And so you've got to have a team that's ready to play each week regardless of how they're favored. And so you look at some of the teams that they have to play, they've got to make sure they're ready for the game. So let's look at it. It's on the bottom line now, right?
So Maryland, you got Wisconsin, Penn State, Ohio State, and Rutgers the rest of the way.
Right. So, you could say that that's pretty matched up, right? I mean, the Ohio State thing obviously is a tough go, but they match up with Wisconsin this weekend. Penn State, Maryland is a little bit of a rivalry. If nothing else, I don't think each coaches have dinner together a lot. I think they may have their own rivalry, and then they match up well against Rutgers. So, not being upset gives them a chance to win 8 games at Maryland. That would going into a bowl game. If they beat Wisconsin and Rutgers, who I see as matchups, they're at 8. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it'll be an awfully impressive year, no doubt. And again, coming on the heels of a bowl appearance last year. I know you group Minnesota into this category as well. You see, again, Nebraska, as we know, coming up on Saturday, Northwestern, certainly a game in which you would figure they'd be favored. I might say the same of Iowa and Wisconsin. I mean, to me, are you looking at this from Minnesota's point of view as you need to run the table? Or is there a game in there that you could see them losing and you wouldn't feel like that was a black mark against them?
I guess I just look at Minnesota. They're 5-3 overall, right? They match up with all these West Division teams. Would you agree? I mean,
sure.
They're probably favored for all 4. And so that's a 9-win season. I think this is what is expected of Minnesota at this time in point of PJ's program, that they should win all these games. Now, there's still going to be tough games. I'm just saying, if they lose one of those games, they've been upset. They started really hot, then they struggled. I think people expect them to finish really hot.
I guess I wonder a little bit whether we're reading too much into the Rutgers game. And, look, they had 3 weeks where they did not play well at all. And so who is the real Minnesota? I think that's the other thing we're going to find out here down the stretch. But I'm with you. I mean, all those games eminently winnable, and I don't think it's in any way out of the question to say those could be, those are games maybe you should feel like you're favored to win, or you should win if you are where you believe you are as a program. What about Purdue? Purdue's a fascinating team to me because they're the one team that could ruin this for Illinois and come out and win the West. I mean, these are all winnable games for Purdue. If they win out, Jerry, they're going to the Big Ten championship game.
And you look at that schedule, they could win out. Now, they've got to get some energy back. I mean, I felt like, and I think most people who watched last week's Wisconsin game, they didn't play with a lot of energy. I mean, they look like a flat team. But they match up with everybody, including Illinois. I mean, Illinois is playing at a high level. Are they more talented than Purdue? I don't know that we could say that. It's probably a push here. I mean, you could go position by position. So they're in position to win those 4, but they have to play with a lot more energy than they played at Wisconsin.
I just think the level of consistency from Illinois is so much better than the level of consistency from Purdue.
They're opposite. I mean, Purdue is an up-and-down team, and Illinois is like this.
And so then you ask yourself whether or not they have it in them to win 4 straight games, even against teams that you could make an argument they certainly could beat. I don't want to say they should beat them all. I think Illinois is a better team, but certainly could beat all of them. But do they have it in them to play 4 straight really good games?
Well, that's the intriguing part about this month of football, right? I mean, Jeff Brown can stand up in front of his team and say, hey, I'll take responsibility for being like this, but if we want to, we got to be. And so every team now gets to assess everything that's happened to the last 4 weeks. You sit with your staff, you try to figure what the buttons are that we have to push to play really hard for the next 4 weeks. The next group is going to be pretty easy to understand.
Yes, there's a self-explanatory nature, I think, to this last one, and it is teams that cannot afford to lose again. And you're starting, interestingly, lately, though, you were starting with Penn State, who I would say, for all intents and purposes, they're out of it. I mean, they're out of the Big Ten race. They're out of the Big Ten East race. They would need some cataclysmic events. They need the Ohio State and Michigan to lose 3 times to have a shot to win it. So why do you say Penn State can't afford to lose again?
Because they are clearly the team in the East, other than Ohio State and Michigan, that are built, have recruited to win the East. And before you win the East, you've got to beat everybody but who's been winning the East, and that's Michigan and Ohio State. They're not out of a New Year's Day bowl game. I mean, there's a lot to be happy about, and not to be negative, but it only can get worse for Penn State. It can't get any better because Penn State people expect them to win the last 4, and if they win the last 4 and they're 10-2, okay, we played poorly against Michigan. We played better against Ohio State. We got a young quarterback. I mean, again, this is what everyone is thinking about the last month. We're not the only ones having this conversation. People at Penn State are saying, we should win out. We've got better players than those 4 teams.
Right.
We've got a
so
better
your
program.
point is, if you don't win out, what does it say about where you are?
I mean, nothing's finalized. I'm just saying it only can get worse. It can't get any better because getting better, you've had 2 opportunities to get better. Those are behind you.
So the other ones, again, self-explanatory with Michigan and Ohio State. I mean, pretty straightforward. You're battling to be in the CFP. You're obviously battling to win the Big Ten East to beat your rival. What do you see here with these schedules?
Okay, so this is really interesting. Ohio State clearly has the easier schedule, although Maryland's got a lot of talent, right? Michigan, Illinois, I mean, all of a sudden that's the 16th ranked team in the country. I think Michigan thinks a little bit different than Ohio State. I think Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, it really is week by week, and we'll deal with Ohio State at the end. They're not as I don't want to say they're not obsessed with the rivalry as much. I think their approach is different. I think at Ohio State, they're not afraid to talk about the last game before it's before the week of the last game. Urban used to say, we work on Michigan he didn't say Michigan. We work on Michigan every day. You got to dig a little bit.
Up north.
Yeah, the team up north. You have to dig a little bit to find out what he means. He may mean just someone gave him an article about Michigan. It's not like they're practicing against them. But he acknowledges that rivalry. And we've had this conversation for 15 or 16 years or 20 years, whatever it's been with us together. Michigan's at Michigan State, and sometimes they have Notre Dame. And so their rivalries are a little different than Ohio State. Yeah. But all 3 of those teams are expected to win out.
18 years. Yeah, we've had a lot of the same conversations. But this is a particularly important one here down the stretch, obviously with the massive CFP ramifications. I would submit to you those next to last games, right? The game that precedes the game for each one of these teams looks so different than it did at the beginning of the year. I mean, I'd say particularly with Michigan taking on Illinois. I don't think they came into this year in any way thinking that could be the second toughest game that we play all year, but it very well may be. For Ohio State, I think you knew, going on the road, playing Maryland, you knew they were going to be explosive offensively, but how does that change the dynamic with each one of them?
Well, how about the style of the game as well? The Michigan-Illinois game may be over in an hour and a half, right? I mean, the way and then Michigan and Maryland and Ohio State could take 5 hours. It changes the dynamic a little bit. I think that's probably going to be, let's deal with that when it comes. I mean, if I'm Michigan, let's see where Illinois is when we're playing, and we'll figure out if that has anything to do with playing Ohio State. And then Ohio State, let's see what Maryland's like by the time we get there. So I don't know that we can focus that far, but you make a great point in that the game before the game, how much energy you put into it, how do you come out with any injuries? What's the game plan look like? Do you play your second team with a smaller lead than you would have to rest your play? I mean, there's a lot of things that go on.
The fact is, if they are both undefeated going into that game, the game that precedes them, that game doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, that's true. Right.
I mean, it does matter, like maybe for the CFP, but if you win in your game against Ohio State or Michigan, depending on who you are the next week, and then you win the Big Ten championship game, I still think you're going to the CFP with 1 loss. I don't know. Maybe you don't want to roll the dice there, but it's going to be a fascinating dynamic as we head down the stretch. Big Ten action on Saturday. Everyone's playing, as I mentioned, 4 games in the early window. Second-ranked Buckeyes will be in Evanston. Purdue trying to stay in that West race as it hosts Iowa. Mid-afternoon has West leader Illinois hosting Michigan State. Penn State going to Indiana, and then Michigan at Rutgers in prime time. Let's break a few of these down. Start with Michigan State and Illinois. We touched on the Spartans a little bit, but certainly interesting storylines on both sides, Jerry.
Yeah, and I think it's mostly how they're going about their business. This time of year, it's hard really X and O wise, everyone's kind of declared themselves, right? I mean, Illinois wants to be a balanced team, and they've been pretty good at that. They want to be a physical team. Michigan State has struggled really on both sides of the ball, so you can do some X and O matchups. But I think this time of year, really the mind game is the most intense thing. Michigan State, a lot of energy last week against Michigan, right? I mean, they were ready to play, and then you had the suspension, which carries through this week. So for Michigan State, can they get juiced up again, especially with a distraction, right? That's their challenge. You look at Illinois, can Illinois continue to deal with success? And so far, Brett Bielema has been very good at getting his team to deal with success. I can remember last week when they were playing, who'd they play? And he said, well, we lost to Indiana and they beat in Nebraska, right? So he always has a plan or something relevant that helps you get ready for the game mentally. So that's how I see that game. The X's and O's are pretty clear. Can Illinois continue to play at a high level? And can Michigan State get excited about playing this game, especially with the distraction?
Illinois, obviously, with a ton on the line here and could win the division by winning their next two games. This one and the Purdue game could still win it, even if they don't win this weekend. But you could see Brett as he's looking for ways to keep his team focused and to not be congratulating themselves, right, on what they've accomplished to this point. That seems like a really good incentive and a way to rally the guys. It just feels like he has known which buttons to push with this team all along. And yeah, fascinated to watch Michigan State to see how they deal with the suspended players and to see how they deal with the struggles they've had. I mean, they have lost 5 straight on the road. 6 in a row would be their longest such skid since 1941. I mean, it's been a while. You think of how high they were just a year ago. Purdue, we mentioned the big game at Illinois next week. They host Iowa on Saturday. This is a game they've got to get. Iowa, as you mentioned, feeling better about themselves. It was against a Northwestern defense that has been dreadful, but it still gives them a little bit of momentum and just shows them that you can move the ball on somebody. So how do you see the dynamic here between these two?
Right, so think about Iowa. The last 3 games they lost were to Illinois, that we've been bragging about all year, Michigan and Ohio State. Then they beat Northwestern, right? Yeah, Northwestern's not a great team. They're really struggling. But they have to feel as good about themselves as they have felt all year. You know, the outside noise has probably calmed down a little bit, although everyone qualifies it by, well, it was Northwestern. But still, they won the game. And historically, when Northwestern has played Iowa, right, you know better than anybody because you know all the numbers. That's been a tough game, right?
Yeah.
So even on any year, so they feel really good about themselves. The Purdue thing is puzzling in that when they played Wisconsin last game, they really seemed flat, and they had so much to play for. Was it 25 or 15 years since they had beaten Wisconsin? Do I have that right?
20 years, yeah.
20 years. I mean, that motivates any team, and yet they looked like they were unmotivated. My personal experience is when a team's unmotivated, that's my fault. That's the head coach's fault. And so I think Jeff Brom, who I don't think is a rah-rah guy, but I think he'll obviously have them ready. And much like Illinois, you know, they can still win this thing. But they're going to have a hard time winning it if they lose this game, right? And so
Virtually impossible.
Virtually impossible,
say, yeah.
right? Everybody would have to totally fall apart. So again, it's not as much X's and O's this time of year. Although if you want to get into the X's and O's, most people play man coverage. Iowa plays zone coverage. Jeff Brom's a great play caller. He's a great scheme guy. So Phil Parker against Jeff Brom, certainly if you're into the X's and O's, this will be a great watch.
What about Maryland and Wisconsin? Interesting matchup here. We were talking about it earlier. The Badgers have their back up against the wall as they look to get themselves into a bowl game. Terps have to feel good. They really got away with that Leah injury, right? They were able to hold him out for the week against Northwestern, still win that game. Then they got the bye week. Now they get him back, presumably at full strength. Really interesting game.
Right, so if I'm Maryland, this is the continuing to build a program tour, right? This is one of the powers in the West, although they're not great. So they're going to Wisconsin. Can we win there? If you look at the last 2 games Wisconsin played pass defense-wise, Michigan State had their way, and that's why Michigan State won the game against Wisconsin, and then Wisconsin played good enough defense to defeat Purdue. So Mike Loxley, Dan Enos, offensive staff, you know, can we take advantage of a Wisconsin secondary that when they played Michigan State didn't look very good. I think they gave up 7 big plays over 15 yards. They gave up a 72-yard pass, and they just couldn't defend the pass.
Yeah, pretty interesting to think of the degree to which, I don't want to say Wisconsin has struggled on defense, but the averageness of the Wisconsin defense, where it's been an area where they have excelled so much historically in recent years coming into this season, but just has not been the case this year. And we'll see whether or not it bites them against the Maryland team that can really move the ball, third in the Big Ten in total offense. CFP rankings came out on Tuesday. Tennessee #1 for the first time ever, largely on the strength of its win over Alabama, but also took care of LSU. Ohio State's 2, Georgia and Clemson round out the top 4. Michigan ends up at 5, perhaps surprisingly, and one loss, Alabama ahead of TCU. Here to shed some light on this situation is Joel Klatt, who joins us for our weekly visit here. And Joel, the first CFP rankings there, you got a chance to digest them here over the last couple days. Let's start with what I think is the most interesting one from the Big Ten's point of view, and that is the 4-5 with Michigan and Clemson. Clemson being ranked ahead of the Wolverines. What did you make of that?
Yeah, it was, I think the ghosts of championship past are helping Clemson out and their reputation helping them out more than what they've actually done on the field this year, which is certainly a problem that the committee didn't address. Michigan's the better team. I think that they've got easily the eye test win. What's hurting Michigan in this argument, though, is the fact that the middle of the Big Ten hasn't really held up their bargain, in particular a team like Michigan State, right? So now that win doesn't look like it normally would in a normal year, or Iowa would be in that same boat. So Michigan's now going to be backloaded, okay? So now their big wins or ranked wins would be Penn State and then Illinois and Ohio State at the end of the year. So there's a nod to Clemson having those 3 ranked wins with those ACC teams being 20 through 22. And then again, kind of ghosts of championship past. I think that this is a nod to guys like Deshaun Watson and Hunter Renfrow and Trevor Lawrence over what the team has actually done. Because when you look at Clemson, you see the way that they've played, their strength of schedule, their strength of record, their game control. It's not anywhere close to what Michigan has done, at least this season.
The way that Michigan won its marquee game is certainly far more impressive than anything Clemson has done.
There's no doubt. I didn't even touch on that because, Clemson had to pull their quarterback to win at home over Syracuse, and there's Michigan with a better win than any win that Clemson has, and they did it by absolutely destroying Penn State, way more so than even Ohio State did. So they didn't get any credit. And again, I think it's reputational based, and that's a problem. I don't think that this committee is very good at their job this year.
Could you elaborate on that? What else stands out to you as not being particularly good?
Well, a clear brand bias against TCU. You put them against that same Clemson team that we're talking about. And again, it's the ghosts of Clemson championship past that it's getting them ranked ahead of a team like TCU. TCU is a team that if you attach the exact same resume, same wins and losses, same statistics defensively and offensively, same wins, all of it, right? Struggling in some of the games and having to come back. And you just say, hey, that's Texas or Oklahoma, they would easily be in the top 4. The brand bias against TCU and the burden of proof on them is very clear. That committee put a glass ceiling on the TCU Horned Frogs. This is the only team in America that has thrown the ball for 300 and run the ball for 200. Plus, they have 20 touchdowns both passing and rushing. This is a team that has 2 better wins than any one win that Clemson has. Both of those ranked, Oklahoma State and Kansas State. And yet they're ranked behind a 1-loss Alabama. And the only explanation we get, Rev, is like, well, they were behind in some games. Oh, that's interesting. Kind of like when Alabama was behind, when the clock struck 0. Like, isn't the point to win and lose? How about the game at home for Clemson when they're down and have to pull their quarterback? So grab bag excuses for why they put one team over another, but it came down to reputation in the end. It was reputation for Clemson over Michigan. It was reputation for Alabama over TCU as well as Clemson. And I don't think that that's right. I think that we should be viewing teams in this year. In the NIL and transfer portal era, these teams have a shelf life of 12 months at the very longest. So I think that we should be viewing them and rewarding them as such.
I know you had said all along that you thought that Tennessee would be #1, so no great surprise there. Ohio State comes in at #2. What do you think of where the Buckeyes were ranked, not just as opposed to where Tennessee is, but the rest of that group just below them. What do you
Yeah.
think about where they fit the Buckeyes in?
I actually thought that it was a huge nod to what they think that the Buckeyes are because, yes, the Penn State win is good, and I've argued as such, in particular on the road. You don't beat many top 15 teams on the road. When you look at those wins and losses of all the teams, 12, 13, 14th top teams in the country, very rare that you find one of those teams getting beat at home. And Ohio State was able to do that. But that being said, I think that Georgia's win over Oregon, not carrying the day and putting Georgia 2 is a huge nod to what the committee thinks Ohio State is. And I don't disagree with them, by the way. I talked about on my podcast this week, Rev, like the gear that we saw from Ohio State in the six snaps of the football at the 9:26 mark of that fourth quarter against Penn State was, stratospheric, right? Like they went to a level that not many, if any, team can go to in the country. And I think the committee, that ranking was a nod to that.
3 plays, 75 yards there, really impressive. And as you say, Georgia, let's give credit where it's due. They absolutely dismantled Oregon, a team that the committee has solidly in the top 10. So it does speak to how good they think Ohio State is. I guess I just think in tandem here, I wonder a little bit about the possibility of the Big Ten getting 2 in. I felt better about it before Tuesday night's rankings than I do now, but I guess that is more a function of how the committee's looking at Michigan. It feels to me like the only way now for the Big Ten to get 2 in is were Michigan to be the Big Ten champ and Ohio State not to be and not even to win the Big Ten East, but just have the one loss to Michigan, whereas I kind of believed beforehand that maybe there was a possibility either way if one of them just had one loss. It feels less likely to me with Michigan now than it did before Tuesday.
I don't disagree with that. And in particular, when you're looking at the SEC coalition, and I'm not saying this is wrong, but this is just kind of reality. With 5 SEC teams in the top 11, and with LSU being the largest outlier in the entire poll, what LSU acts as right now currently is a backstop for Tennessee. Okay, so like, let's say LSU gets beat this weekend. They're not going to fall more than 10 spots, right? Because they're not going to go from 10 to 25 or out of the rankings. So the fact that they moved them way up as it relates to the AP poll means that they could only fall a certain amount. That's just kind of human nature and the way that the poll has always worked. So let's say that they lose. Well, they'll still probably be in the teens at that point. Well, let's say Georgia beats Tennessee. Well, they can still say, well, they beat LSU on the road. So now all of a sudden you've got this backstop for Tennessee. And the fact that there could be 3 SEC teams with 1 loss, or you've got Bama, Georgia, and Tennessee, I think that's why it's going to be really tough for the Big Ten. If it was very clear that every conference was involved and there wasn't one other conference that had those 3 teams kind of primed with a backstop like LSU and Ole Miss, then I would say the Big Ten has a chance. But I agree with you. After Tuesday, it looks to me like it's going to have to be winning in for the Big Ten champ.
Let me leave you with this, Joel. You've been critical of the rankings here and saying there are some things that the committee didn't necessarily get right. This is not a new phenomenon in terms of criticizing this group. How would you improve this system?
Yeah.
Like, is this just an impossible task that's put in front of them, or are there ways, in your opinion, to do it better?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad you do that because I generally don't like people that just complain with no solutions. So I really do appreciate you offering me this ability, and I'll take a moment and explain. First and foremost, I think that we need 3 or 4 committees of 12 or 15 people because the laws of statistical variance, right? In a 12-person committee, one biased vote is going to change the rankings to a much greater degree than if we have one biased vote across 3 different committees. Okay, so that's number one. I think that we need to increase the inputs in the variable. The second thing that we need to do is just expand the playoff. The 4-team playoff has really hurt college football as a whole. This invitational, the subjective nature, has dramatically changed the way that we view programs and the perception of those programs nationally. And I think the ranking of a team like Utah or TCU in this first version is great evidence of that. Because there's two things that I know to be true about these rankings, that they do matter because they are the recipe to get to the 4-team playoff, and that they produce the perception of what your program is. And it's very clear that this committee and these rankings, the way that it's currently built, has a glass ceiling above teams like TCU or even Utah. And the burden of proof is on the little guy and not the big guy in college football. So if I get a letter in recruiting, and I'm a high school kid, and I get a letter from TCU and one of the blue bloods, if you will, the perception and glass ceiling over those programs is going to matter. So we need to expand the playoff so that more teams can define themselves as successful in our sport. We used to be able to define ourselves as successful for bowl games and then better bowl games and then division championships and maybe conference championships, but that's no longer the case anymore. As evidence, Ohio State last year loses only 2 games. They win the Rose Bowl, and everyone would say, hey, that's not what we're looking for in Columbus anymore. The playoff has stolen the ability to define yourself as successful unless you're in the 4-team playoff. So expanding it to 12 is going to help the sport overall, and then we need more variables in the equation of how we actually rank teams so that one rogue vote doesn't create an anomaly or an outlier like LSU at number 10 in this version.
It will be interesting, and obviously it is expanding, so you're getting your wish as to whether it happens sooner rather than later. We'll see here whether or not they expedite that, but it will be interesting, I think, to see when we're talking about teams 13 and 14 at the margin rather than teams 5 and 6, how heated the debate
I would
is.
rather have that debate than at 4 and 5.
Me too.
Right?
Yep.
I would just rather have that debate. I'm more accustomed to say, like, sorry, pound sand to team 13 than I am to team 5, right?
Yes, I think when you're saying try not to lose 3 games rather than try not to lose 1 game, I think you have a more compelling argument of, hey, this was in your hands.
And also, even more importantly, Rev, in an expanded playoff, the way that they're going to give it to us is that they clearly define a path to the playoff. It's not subjective. You win your conference and you're basically in because the 6 best champions would go, right? So Tulane would be playing for a playoff berth this year. You know, maybe even UCF as they're kind of creeping up and trying to win a conference championship. TCU is an undefeated and would control their own fate in their own hands rather than, at this point, being undefeated and thinking to themselves, man, we probably need Alabama to lose. You know, like, so controlling your own fate is another big part of that expansion.
Agreed. Always illuminating. Thanks a lot for your time. Look forward to this every week.
You bet. Have a good one, bud.
You too. Hockey, look who is number 1. Michigan up 3 spots this week, taking over the top spot in the nation after a weekend home sweep of a very good Western Michigan team. Minnesota drops from 1 to 3. Ohio State, Notre Dame, Penn State, all in the top 13 nationally. Big Ten Network hockey analyst Paul Caponigri joining us now. And Cappy, Michigan taking over that top spot. They supplant Minnesota. What does this tell us about the depth of the Big Ten? And I hate to skip ahead to the ending here because we're so early in the year, but the possibility of the Big Ten producing a national champion this year.
Yeah, Dave, I mean, we kind of hit on it last week. It's been a long time since a Big Ten schools won a national championship, 2007 with Michigan State. So that's going back before the Big Ten was created 10 years ago. So it's time. And I love Michigan is, you know, they lost a ton of guys last year. Owen Power, Matty Beniers, the list goes on, but they do what Michigan does. They rely on young talent, bringing it in, and it's coming really quick. You know, we're a month into the season, but they are excelling quickly. And like you said, Western Michigan, there was a lot of hype about that series because of what happened last year and how they didn't play each other over the Christmas break. A lot of people thought Michigan had kind of dodged them. Well, they answered the bell this weekend, winning at home and then winning in overtime on a Luke Hughes overtime goal. So it's exciting. And you got Ohio State and Notre Dame along with Minnesota and Michigan. And, you know, you even got to maybe throw Penn State in there. When you can state 5 teams possibly have a chance for a national championship, I like your odds a little more. So you never know what happens in the end. but having more teams obviously gives you better odds.
It is pretty remarkable, as you said, with Michigan. I mean, you lose 6 of the top 7 scorers. You obviously had a tumultuous offseason with a coaching change, and yet to be right there this early in the season at number 1 really says something about the program. I want to dive a little deeper into some of those other programs that you were talking about. There were some really interesting results over the weekend. You had Ohio State get a really impressive win over Minnesota. Penn State and Notre Dame both looked really good. Give me a sense for what stood out last weekend results-wise to you.
You know, what stood out possibly is, are we looking maybe at the same thing as last year, where there's the top is way up here and the bottom might be a separation, with maybe adding Penn State into that mix? They went into Wisconsin, and it was really their first kind of semi-challenge of the year on the road. They've had a really light non-conference schedule, but they went in and swept Wisconsin, gave up 1 goal in the 2 games. And then, you know, hockey's just crazy how the Big Ten, you play twice every weekend. So with those 5 teams at the top, it's going to be hard for those teams to get sweeps. So you saw it with Ohio State and Minnesota. Ohio State dominated Friday night, but Minnesota came back strong on Saturday. So you have that dynamic in the Big Ten where it's really hard to get on a roll because you got to play back-to-back nights. And if you beat a team the night before, it's really hard to come back and do it again, especially with those top echelon teams. And you saw Notre Dame get a win at home over Michigan State and then a tie essentially on Saturday. Michigan State's coming, but I don't know if they're going to be able to compete at the top of the conference yet. So you're seeing a lot of what we saw last year early on, and you might continue to see it.
Cappy, I did want to get into Penn State. I mean, they're off to a great start, the best start in program history. Liam Soulier's been fantastic between the pipes. We really saw it here last weekend. Got off to a little bit of a slow start last year, came on at the end, and it seems like he has hit the ground running this season. Give us a sense of what you've seen from him and maybe how he changes the perception of that Penn State team that you mentioned here a couple times.
Absolutely. You see those numbers down at the bottom of the screen, a 1.5 goals against and a 945 save percentage. I mean, those are elite numbers. And when Penn State has had success in their program, they've gotten consistent goaltending. You can go back to Peyton Jones 3-4 years ago. That's when Penn State was making runs. They won a Big Ten championship. Goaltending has been their key because they are a team that likes to play offense and run and gun, if you want to say it. But they rely on the goaltender to make the big save at the big time. And Liam has kind of grown. This is his first full year where he's going to get all the games most likely, and he's off to a great start. You know, I call a little caution. Obviously, like I mentioned, their non-conference schedule wasn't very difficult, so it's a wait and see. But they're going to get challenged this weekend coming up with Michigan. But what I've seen, he's not a big guy. He's athletic. He doesn't give up the bad goal. And, you know, that can be deflating to a team, and you haven't seen that from him because a team can be dominating play in a hockey game, and then the other team goes down, gets one chance, and they score, and you'll see a lot of slumped shoulders on the bench, and he hasn't been doing that, and I think that's leading to some Penn State success.
Faced 64 shots last weekend, 63 saves. Pretty impressive there. You mentioned the save percentage is off the charts. And as you said, look, they're going to really get tested here. They've got Michigan coming up this weekend. They go to Minnesota the following weekend. So we'll know an awful lot about Penn State here coming up over the next couple weeks. The Wolverines obviously have been a fantastic story, and Adam Fantilli, the freshman, is just off to a tremendous start. You know, we've had these players here at Michigan the last few years who come in with tremendous hype, and it just feels like it's got to be a lot of pressure on your shoulders, and Fantilli has lived up to it and more. A guy who's leading the nation in scoring. What makes him so special?
You know, it's remarkable. I mean, he just turned 18 like 2 weeks ago, October 12th. So add that. I mean, and it looks like he just doesn't have he just steps in. It's the next level. This is what I'm supposed to be. It's why he's the number 2 rated guy for the draft this year. I'm not so sure he's got a chance to get to number 1. But you see it right here in some of the highlights. He does it all. He can score. He can dish it. He's got the size. He knows how to use his body in traffic. It's just really remarkable how these young guys can come in and just look like seasoned veterans right away. And, you know, they've got a lot of other guys that are heavily led by a lot of freshmen and sophomores, which is the norm at Michigan. But he is the number one reason why they've been, everyone thought they were a top 10 team, but he is the guy, the reason why they're at number one right now in early November.
Averaging better than 2 points per game here early on in the season.
Astounding.
So give us a sense for this matchup then. Penn State and Michigan. We mentioned a couple of the principals involved, but what are the biggest things you're watching?
Well, I mean, the goaltending is going to be huge. We hit on Liam Soulier is huge for Penn State, but these are the two top offensive teams in the country right now. Early in the season, Michigan's over 5 goals a game. Penn State's at about 4.7. So, I mean, that's right there. And it's the key is goaltending and the mistakes, keeping the mistakes to a minimum. It's going to be fun to watch. I think you're going to see a track field type of matchup going back and forth with offense, which I love to see as a former forward. I want to see goals and speed and finesse, and I think you're going to see all that. And yeah, I'm excited to see Penn State. Yeah, they're 8-0. Hey, you play the teams that are in front of you. They won all 8 games. They didn't have a ton of tests so far, but they've answered it. So now they're going to be playing at home, which I think is going to be a benefit. Pagula is a great home ice advantage. 6,000 fans will be packed in. The student section will be rocking behind Eric Portillo to give him a hard time. So I'm excited to see how they come out in their first big challenge. And Michigan, they had some road challenges that had success. So I don't think they're going to be fazed by it. So I can't wait to see Friday night what it brings.
Nittany Lions have never beaten number one. They are 0-3 all time. See whether they can do it starting tomorrow night here on the Big Ten Network. Paul Caponigri, always great stuff. Thanks a lot, Cappy.
You got it, Dave.
Again, you can catch that showdown tomorrow. Number 1 Michigan colliding with 13th ranked Penn State. The puck drops at 8 Eastern, only on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app.